Hey there, tonight we're exploring something particularly sinister about getting your first period in medieval times. This wasn't a milestone to celebrate with cake and congratulations. Instead, it was the moment when everyone you trusted, your neighbors, your community, even your own family, would suddenly turn against you and brand you as a witch. So dim those lights, get comfortable in your warm, safe bed, and let's explore just how terrifying this natural process used to be. Before we begin tonight's rather eye-opening tale, take a moment to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy these deep dives into history's uncomfortable truths. And please like this video if it helps you drift off to sleep while learning something fascinating and, frankly, terrifying about our ancestors. Now dim those lights, maybe grab your favorite blanket, and let's settle in together for a story that will make you incredibly grateful for the century you were born into. Tonight, we're traveling back to medieval Europe, specifically to the year 1347, and we're going to experience something that sounds routine today, but was essentially a death sentence back then. We're talking about getting your first period as a young girl in the Middle Ages. I want you to imagine this with me. You're 12 years old, maybe 13, if you're lucky enough to have delayed puberty, which actually was a blessing in disguise back then. You wake up one morning in your family's single-room cottage. There's no glass in the windows, just oiled cloth that barely keeps out the cold. The air smells of smoke, unwashed bodies, and the animals that share your living space. Your bed is a pile of straw covered with a rough wool blanket that hasn't been washed in months, maybe years. You shift in your sleep and feel something warm and wet between your legs. In the dim light filtering through that cloth window, you see it. Dark red stains on your thin linen shift, spreading across the straw beneath you. You have absolutely no idea what's happening to your body. No one has explained anything to you about what to expect as you grow up. The concept of puberty education doesn't exist. Your mother, if she's still alive, has been too busy trying to keep the family from starving to discuss the mysteries of womanhood. Your first instinct is pure terror. Are you dying? Have you been cursed? Did you commit some terrible sin that God is now punishing you for? These are the thoughts racing through your 12-year-old mind as you stare at this blood that seems to be coming from nowhere, from inside your own body, for no reason you can understand. You call out for your mother, your voice shaking with fear. When she sees the blood, her reaction isn't comforting or educational. It's horror mixed with resignation. She knows what this means, and she knows what's coming next. Not just the monthly bleeding, but everything that follows, the immediate pressure to marry you off before you become too much of a burden, the understanding that your childhood, what little of it you had, is now officially over. But in 1347, getting your period doesn't just mean growing up. It means entering a world of medical ignorance so profound, social restrictions so crushing, and physical dangers so real that many girls simply don't survive their first year of menstruation. We're not talking about discomfort or inconvenience. We're talking about a genuine threat to your life that will repeat itself every month until pregnancy, illness, or death stops it. See, medieval Europeans had some truly bizarre ideas about women's bodies and what menstruation actually meant. They believed that women were naturally more sinful than men, more susceptible to evil influences, and that monthly bleeding was proof of this spiritual corruption. They thought menstrual blood was literally poisonous, capable of spoiling food, killing plants, and attracting demons. Some believed that if a menstruating woman looked into a mirror, it would become clouded forever. The medical establishment, such as it was, had their own theories that were equally dangerous. They believed in something called the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness came from these being out of balance. Our menstruation was seen as the body trying to expel excess corrupted blood, but they also believed this process could easily go wrong and kill you. Your family is probably going to call in the local priest first, because clearly something supernatural is happening to you. After all, you're bleeding from a place blood shouldn't come from. You're probably experiencing mood changes from the hormones your body is suddenly producing, and you might be having cramps that make you cry out in pain. To medieval minds, this looks exactly like demonic possession. If you're lucky, your family might have enough money to call in a barber surgeon, the closest thing to a doctor available in most places. But luck is a relative term here because medieval medical treatment for menstrual problems involved techniques that were more likely to kill you than help you. Bloodletting, which meant cutting open your veins to drain out the bad blood, was a popular choice. Never mind that you're already losing blood naturally, they're going to take more of it until you're weak and anemic. The herbal remedies available were a mixed bag of the harmless, the helpful, and the absolutely lethal. Some wise women in villages knew about plants that could ease cramps or reduce heavy bleeding, but they had to be incredibly careful about sharing this knowledge. Being too knowledgeable about women's health issues could get you accused of witchcraft faster than you could say ergot poisoning. And speaking of ergot, that was one of the common treatments for menstrual pain. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, and while it can help with uterine contractions during childbirth, it's also incredibly toxic. Too much ergot could cause hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. But hey, at least your cramps might stop. What you're facing as a 12-year-old girl in 1347 isn't just one medical crisis. It's a cascade of social, religious, and physical challenges that will define and quite possibly end your life. Your first period is the starting gun for a race you're almost certainly going to lose. But the bleeding itself, terrifying as it is when you don't understand it, is actually the least of your problems. What happens next is where things get truly nightmarish. Let's continue with your story because unfortunately that first moment of discovering blood was just the very beginning of your nightmare. What happens in the hours and days following your first period in medieval times would be traumatic by any standard, but for a 12-year-old child who has no context for what's happening to her body, it's absolutely devastating. Picture this: you've called for your mother and she's seen the blood. Her face goes white, then she crosses herself and starts muttering prayers under her breath. This isn't the reaction of a woman who understands that her daughter has simply reached a natural milestone of development. This is the reaction of someone who believes her child might be dying, cursed, or possessed by evil spirits. Your mother doesn't sit you down for a gentle explanation about womanhood. Instead, she strips the bloody straw from your bed and burns it immediately, as if it's contaminated with plague. She makes you wash in freezing water because cleanliness might appease whatever supernatural force has invaded your body. The soap, if your family can afford it, is made from animal fat and ash, harsh enough to leave your skin raw and burning. But the washing isn't comforting or thorough. Medieval people believed that too much bathing could actually make you more susceptible to disease by opening your pores to evil influences. So you're cleaned just enough to remove the visible blood, but not enough to feel truly clean. You're left feeling sticky, uncomfortable, and still terrified about what's happening to you. Your father, when he's told what's occurred, reacts with a mixture of dread and grim calculation. This isn't a celebration of his daughter becoming a woman. This is a financial and social crisis that needs to be managed quickly. You see, a menstruating daughter is a liability in medieval society. You're now capable of becoming pregnant, which means you're also capable of bringing shame on the family if you're not married off immediately. The neighbors will know something is happening because your family's behavior changes overnight. You're suddenly not allowed to help with certain tasks. You can't touch the bread dough because medieval people believed menstrual blood would prevent it from rising. You can't help with brewing beer or wine because your presence might sour the entire batch. You can't tend to sick family members because you might make them worse just by being near them. Word spreads quickly in a small medieval community. Other women in the village give you looks that are part sympathy, part fear, and part relief that it's not their daughter facing this transition. The men avoid looking at you directly as if whatever supernatural force has taken hold of you might be contagious. Within days, your family receives visits from local families with sons of marriageable age. These aren't romantic courtship visits, these are business negotiations, and you're the commodity being discussed. Your dowry, such as it is, needs to be arranged quickly before you become pregnant out of wedlock, or before the family can no longer afford to feed another mouth that isn't contributing to the household income. But here's where medieval medical ignorance becomes truly dangerous for you. Your family doesn't understand that the bleeding will stop on its own in a few days and then return monthly. They think this is an ongoing medical crisis that needs immediate intervention. So they call in the local healer, priest, or barber surgeon, whoever they can afford or whoever is available. The healer arrives with a bag of implements that would look more at home in a torture chamber than a medical practice. Iron tools that haven't been cleaned, herbs of questionable origin, and bottles of liquids that smell like they've been fermenting in a barn. Remember, the germ theory of disease won't be discovered for another 500 years. The idea that cleanliness prevents infection is not even a concept yet. The examination is traumatic and invasive. You're in pain from cramps, scared out of your mind, and now strange hands are probing your body while your family watches and discusses your condition as if you're not even there. The healer pronounces that your humors are severely imbalanced and that immediate treatment is necessary to prevent the corruption from spreading throughout your body and killing you. The first treatment is bloodletting. Using a knife that's been used on other patients without cleaning, the healer makes cuts on your arms or applies leeches to draw out the excess blood. This is particularly ironic since you're already losing blood naturally, but medieval logic doesn't account for irony. You're weakened further by losing even more blood, which makes you pale, dizzy, and even more frightened. Next comes the herbal treatment. You're forced to drink concoctions made from plants that range from mildly helpful to potentially lethal. Some contain ergot, which we mentioned earlier, causing hallucinations and convulsions. Others contain mercury or lead compounds that were thought to purify the blood, but actually caused heavy metal poisoning. Still others contain plants like pennyroyal or tansy, which could cause organ damage or death. The pain from your natural menstrual cramps is now compounded by the pain from the medical treatments. You're experiencing nausea from the herbal medicines, weakness from the bloodletting, and terror from not understanding what's happening to you. Your family interprets your worsening condition as proof that whatever evil has taken hold of you is fighting back against the treatment. If you survive the first few days of medical intervention, you still face the ongoing challenge of managing your period with no understanding of hygiene or proper materials. You're given rags if you're lucky, or told to use moss, grass, or whatever absorbent material the family can spare. These materials aren't changed frequently enough, aren't cleaned properly between uses, and quickly become breeding grounds for bacteria. Infection sets in quickly under these conditions. What we now know as toxic shock syndrome was probably common among menstruating medieval women, though they had no name for it and no understanding of what caused it. The fever, vomiting, and confusion that accompany severe infections were often interpreted as signs that demons were taking stronger hold of the victim. But even if you somehow survive your first period and the medieval medical response to it, you're not out of danger yet, because now your family knows that this nightmare is going to repeat itself every month, and they need to find a permanent solution to the problem you've become, and that solution is almost certainly going to involve marriage to a man who may be decades older than you, whether you want it or not. Now, let's talk about what happens when medieval religious authorities get involved in your situation, because unfortunately, having your first period in 1347 isn't just a medical issue or a family crisis. It's a spiritual emergency that threatens the very soul of your community, at least according to the church. Within hours of your family discovering your condition, word has likely reached the local priest. This isn't because your family wants spiritual guidance about your transition into womanhood. It's because they genuinely believe you might be possessed by demons, and they need professional help from someone who knows how to deal with supernatural threats. The medieval Christian church had very specific and very terrifying ideas about women's bodies and menstruation. They taught that women were inherently more sinful than men, more susceptible to temptation, and more likely to be influenced by evil forces. Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden was seen as a permanent stain on all womankind, and menstruation was viewed as a monthly reminder of that spiritual corruption. When the priest arrives at your family's cottage, he's not coming to offer comfort or education. He's coming to assess whether you're experiencing a natural, albeit cursed, biological process, or whether Satan himself has taken up residence in your body. The distinction is crucial because it determines what kind of intervention you'll receive, and honestly, both options are pretty terrible for you. The priest begins his examination by asking about your behavior in the days leading up to the bleeding. Have you been unusually moody? Have you experienced anger, sadness, or any emotions that seem stronger than normal? Have you had any unusual dreams? Have you felt drawn to sin or experienced impure thoughts? Have you been clumsy, forgetful, or different in any way? Of course, the answer to many of these questions is probably yes, because you're a 12-year-old girl whose hormones are suddenly surging through her body for the first time. You're experiencing mood swings, physical discomfort, and emotional changes that are completely normal parts of puberty. But in 1347, these symptoms aren't seen as normal, they're seen as evidence of demonic influence. The priest also examines your physical symptoms with an eye toward supernatural explanations. Are you experiencing pain that seems to move around your body? Do you feel hot and cold at the same time? Are you nauseated? Do you feel weak or dizzy? Again, these are perfectly normal symptoms of menstruation and the medieval medical treatments you've already endured, but to the medieval mind, they're signs that evil spirits are literally inhabiting your flesh. If the priest determines that you're showing signs of possession, the treatment is immediate and brutal. Exorcism in the 14th century isn't the formal, ritualized process that would develop in later centuries. It's a desperate battle for your soul that involves methods designed to make your body so uncomfortable that demons would want to leave it. First comes the fasting. You're already weak from bloodletting and frightened from your ordeal, but now you're denied food for days at a time. The theory is that demons need to feed off your physical strength, so starving your body will starve them too. Never mind that you're a growing adolescent who needs nutrition to survive. The spiritual battle takes precedence over your physical health. The fasting is accompanied by forced prayer marathons. You're required to kneel on the hard stone floor of the church or on the packed dirt floor of your home for hours at a time, reciting prayers in Latin that you probably don't understand. Your knees bleed, your back aches, and you're dizzy from hunger, but any sign of discomfort is seen as the demons fighting back against the holy words. If prayer and fasting don't work quickly enough, the priest might resort to physical methods to drive out the evil spirits. This could involve beating you with holy relics, dousing you with holy water until you're soaked and shivering, or even more extreme measures like pressing heated crosses against your skin to burn out the demonic influence. The entire community becomes involved in your exorcism. Neighbors gather to pray over you, to witness the battle between good and evil taking place in your young body. You become a spectacle, a living example of the spiritual warfare that medieval people believed was constantly raging around them. Your pain, your fear, your confusion all become public entertainment disguised as religious duty. But here's the truly insidious part of this process. Every natural reaction you have to the trauma you're experiencing is interpreted as further evidence of possession. If you cry from pain, that's the demons expressing their anguish at being discovered. If you become angry at your treatment, that's demonic rage manifesting through your voice. If you become withdrawn and silent, that's the evil spirits trying to hide from detection. Meanwhile, your period continues. The bleeding that started this whole nightmare doesn't stop just because a priest has declared it supernatural. But now, instead of being given materials to manage it hygienically, you're told that trying to stop or control the bleeding would be interfering with God's will or the natural process of exorcism. You're left to bleed freely, which adds to your physical discomfort and increases your risk of infection. The psychological trauma of this experience is devastating. You're a child who was already terrified and confused about what was happening to your body, and now You're being told that you're literally fighting for your soul. Every adult you trust is treating you like you're dangerous, corrupted, or possessed by evil. You begin to believe that maybe they're right, maybe you are evil, maybe you deserve everything that's happening to you. Some girls don't survive the exorcism process. The combination of starvation, physical abuse, exposure to cold and dampness, and the stress of the ordeal can be fatal, especially for a young body that's already dealing with the physical changes of puberty and the trauma of medical bloodletting. If you do survive the exorcism, the priest will eventually declare victory over the demons, usually when your period naturally ends after a few days. This isn't seen as proof that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Instead, it's viewed as evidence that the spiritual intervention worked and that your soul has been saved from damnation. But your ordeal is far from over. Now that you've been publicly identified as someone who was susceptible to demonic possession, you're marked forever as spiritually dangerous. People will watch you more carefully, judge your behavior more harshly, and assume that any future problems you experience might be signs that the demons have returned. And remember, this nightmare is going to repeat itself every month. If you somehow survive the exorcism and the priest declares your demons banished, congratulations! You've just earned yourself a ticket to medieval medical treatment, which might actually be worse than demonic possession. Because now that the church has done its part, it's time for the medical professionals to step in and cure you of your monthly bleeding problem permanently. Let's meet your medieval doctor, or more accurately, your barber surgeon. In 1347, there's no real distinction between the person who cuts your hair and the person who performs surgery on your body. The same man who trims beards in the morning might be amputating limbs in the afternoon. His medical training consists of apprenticeship to another barber surgeon, observation of a few procedures, and maybe, if he's lucky, a glimpse of some ancient texts that are wildly inaccurate anyway. Your barber surgeon arrives at your home carrying a leather bag filled with instruments that haven't been cleaned since their last use. The concept of sterilization won't be discovered for another 500 years, so these tools have been used on countless other patients, accumulating blood, pus, and bacteria with each procedure. The rusty knife he'll use to bleed you has probably been inside dozens of other bodies, carrying infections from one patient to the next like a medieval biological weapon. The first thing your doctor wants to do is examine your blood to determine exactly how corrupted it is. He studies the color, consistency, and smell of your menstrual flow with the confidence of someone who thinks he understands what he's looking at. Dark blood means too much black bile. Bright red blood suggests an excess of yellow bile. Thick blood indicates an overabundance of phlegm. Each diagnosis leads to a different treatment protocol, and none of them are going to help you. His first course of treatment is more bloodletting, because clearly the problem is that your body isn't getting rid of the bad blood efficiently enough. He makes fresh cuts on your arms, legs, or neck, depending on which body part he believes is most closely connected to your reproductive organs. Medieval anatomy is wildly inaccurate, so he might decide to bleed you from your forehead to treat your womb problems, or from your ankles to balance your feminine humors. The amount of blood he removes is staggering. A typical bloodletting session might remove a pint or more of blood from your already weakened body. Combined with your natural menstrual bleeding, this leaves you severely anemic. You become pale, weak, and dizzy. Your heart races trying to pump what little blood remains through your system. But these symptoms are interpreted as signs that the treatment is working, that the corruption is leaving your body. If bloodletting alone doesn't seem to be curing you, your doctor moves on to cupping. This involves heating glass or horn cups and placing them on your skin to create suction. The theory is that this will draw the corrupted blood closer to the surface, where it can be more easily removed. In practice, it creates painful bruises and blisters all over your body without addressing any actual medical issues. Next comes the pharmacological assault on your system. Medieval medicine cabinets were filled with substances that ranged from harmless to lethal, and doctors had no reliable way to distinguish between them. For menstrual problems, you might be given mercury, which was thought to purify the blood, but actually causes neurological damage and death. Lead compounds were popular for female troubles, slowly poisoning you while claiming to restore your natural balance. Ergot, that fungus we mentioned earlier, is prescribed in doses that would make a modern pharmacist faint. While small amounts might help with uterine contractions, the quantities used in medieval medicine often caused what we now call ergotism, St. Anthony's fire. This condition involves hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene of the extremities, and often death. But hey, at least your period cramps might subside while you're dying of ergot poisoning. Your doctor might also prescribe remedies made from crushed pearls, ground unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, or powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up Egyptian mummies. These exotic ingredients were expensive, which meant they had to be effective, right? The logic was that rare and costly substances must possess powerful healing properties. The reality was that you were paying a fortune to consume materials that had no medical value whatsoever. If pharmaceutical intervention fails, your doctor might recommend surgery. Medieval surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper anatomical knowledge. The patient was held down by several strong men while the surgeon worked as quickly as possible, hoping to finish before shock or blood loss killed the patient. For menstrual problems, surgical options included scraping the inside of the uterus with unsterilized instruments, cauterizing the cervix with heated irons, or even attempting to realign internal organs by cutting open the abdomen and moving things around manually. The survival rate for these procedures was catastrophically low, but they were considered cutting-edge medicine at the time. Throughout all of this treatment, no one is managing your ongoing menstrual bleeding in any hygienic way. You're still using rags, moss, or whatever absorbent material your family can provide, and these materials aren't being changed frequently or cleaned properly. Infection is almost inevitable under these conditions, but when you develop a fever and become delirious, your doctor interprets this as a sign that the treatments need to be intensified, not that you're dying of sepsis. The combination of bloodletting, toxic medications, surgical trauma, and infection creates a cascade of medical crises that your young body simply cannot handle. Many girls die during this phase of treatment, and their deaths are attributed to the severity of their original condition rather than to the treatments that actually killed them. If you somehow survive your doctor's ministrations, he'll declare you cured when your period naturally ends after a few days. The fact that you're now anemic, poisoned, traumatized, and infected doesn't factor into his assessment of success. You're no longer bleeding, so clearly his treatments worked perfectly. But even if you've survived the church's exorcism and the doctor's cure, your problems are far from over, because now your family knows this nightmare is going to repeat itself every month, and they need a permanent solution. And in medieval society, there's only one permanent solution to the problem of a menstruating daughter: get rid of her as quickly as possible through marriage. Now that you've survived both spiritual intervention and medical treatment, your family faces a harsh reality. You're going to keep bleeding every month for the next 20 to 30 years, assuming you live that long. In medieval society, this isn't just an inconvenience. It's an economic disaster, a social liability, and a ticking time bomb that threatens your family's reputation and survival. The solution is swift and brutal. Get you married off immediately before you become pregnant out of wedlock, or before the family goes bankrupt trying to manage your monthly curse. Your marriageability in 1347 has nothing to do with love, compatibility, or even your personal feelings about the arrangement. You are now a commodity that needs to be moved quickly before its value decreases further. Every month you remain unmarried is another month your family has to provide for you while you're unable to contribute fully to household labor due to your periodic illness. It's another month where you might attract the wrong kind of attention from local men and bring shame on your family name. The marriage negotiations begin immediately, sometimes within days of your first period. Your father, or whoever is the head of your household, starts visiting families with sons of marriageable age. These aren't romantic meetings, they're business transactions where your dowry, your health, your family's reputation, and your potential for bearing children are discussed like livestock trading. You probably won't be present for these negotiations because your opinion on your future husband is completely irrelevant. The age gap between you and your potential husband is likely to be significant and disturbing by modern standards. You're 12 or 13 years old, still a child by any reasonable measure, but medieval society considers you fully adult the moment you start menstruating. Your husband might be 20, 30, or even 40 years older than you. A mature man with an established household who can afford to take on a young wife is considered an excellent match regardless of the fact that you're essentially being sold to someone old enough to be your father or grandfather. Your family is willing to accept a lower dowry or less favorable marriage terms because speed is more important than status. A quick marriage solves multiple problems at once. It removes the financial burden of feeding and housing you. It transfers the responsibility for your monthly bleeding to another family, and it eliminates the risk that you might become pregnant before marriage and destroy your family's honor. The engagement period is mercifully short, usually just long enough to arrange the basic legal and financial documents. There's no time for you to get to know your future husband, no courtship period where you might develop feelings for each other. Medieval marriage isn't about emotional connection, it's about creating stable household units that can survive economically and produce the next generation of workers and potential soldiers. During the brief time between your engagement and wedding, your social status changes dramatically. You're no longer considered a child, but you're not yet a proper wife either. You exist in a liminal space where you're watched constantly for any sign of inappropriate behavior. Any interaction with young men, any display of independence or strong personality, any indication that you might not be a compliant wife is noted and reported back to your future husband's family. Your education, such as it was, now focuses entirely on domestic skills. Reading and writing, if you had any access to them before, are no longer priorities. Instead, you're drilled in cooking, cleaning, childcare, and textile production. You need to be able to run a household immediately upon marriage because pregnancy is expected to follow shortly after the wedding, and pregnancy in medieval times is both debilitating and dangerous. The community treats you differently now too. Older women look at you with a mixture of pity and resignation, knowing what kind of life awaits you. Younger girls watch you with fear, seeing their own future reflected in your rapid transition from childhood to impending motherhood. Men avoid interacting with you directly because you now represent someone else's property, and interfering with another man's wife or intended wife could lead to serious conflict. Your monthly periods continue throughout this engagement period, and each one reinforces your family's urgency to complete the marriage arrangement. Every time you bleed, you're reminded that you're capable of becoming pregnant, and every day you remain unmarried is another day you might conceive a child outside of wedlock. Illegitimate pregnancy would be catastrophic for your family's reputation and could make you completely unmarriageable. The wedding itself is a brief, practical affair. There's no elaborate celebration, no romantic ceremony, no focus on your happiness or your hopes for the future. The wedding is a legal transfer of ownership from your father to your husband, with witnesses present to ensure the transaction is properly recorded. The church's involvement is minimal, focused on making sure the union is legally binding rather than spiritually meaningful. On your wedding night, you're expected to consummate the marriage immediately, regardless of your age, your understanding of sexuality, or your emotional readiness. Medieval society has no concept of consent in the way we understand it today. Once you're married, your body belongs to your husband, and your primary function is to produce children as quickly and as often as possible. But here's the truly terrifying part of your situation. Your monthly bleeding, which got you into this mess in the first place, is now expected to stop as quickly as possible. A good wife becomes pregnant immediately after marriage, and pregnancy stops menstruation. If you continue to have periods month after your wedding, it's seen as evidence that you're not fulfilling your primary duty as a wife. The pressure to become pregnant is intense and immediate. Your new mother-in-law watches for signs that you've missed a period. Your husband's family discusses your fertility as openly as they would discuss the weather. If several months pass without pregnancy, people begin to whisper that you might be barren, cursed, or secretly preventing conception through witchcraft. What no one tells you is that the monthly bleeding that destroyed your childhood is about to be replaced by something even more dangerous: medieval pregnancy and childbirth, where your chances of survival are roughly the same as flipping a coin. Congratulations, you're now married and living in your husband's household. You might think the worst is behind you, but unfortunately, medieval marriage for a girl your age is less like entering a partnership and more like walking into a carefully constructed death trap. Your monthly bleeding, which caused so much terror and upheaval in your family, has now become the least of your worries. Because in medieval society, a wife who continues to menstruate is considered a failure, and the pressure to become pregnant immediately is about to put your life in more danger than any demon or doctor ever could. Your new life begins in a household where you're the lowest ranking member. Your mother-in-law, if she's still alive, views you with suspicion and critical scrutiny. You're an outsider who has been brought in specifically to produce grandchildren, and until you do that, you're essentially worthless. Your husband, who may be kind or cruel, patient or demanding, sees you primarily as a means to continue his family line and increase his household's labor force. The expectation is that you'll become pregnant within the first few months of marriage. Every time you have a period after your wedding, it's noted and discussed by the entire household. After 3 or 4 cycles without conception, people begin to whisper that something might be wrong with you. After 6 months, those whispers become open speculation about whether you're barren, whether the marriage was cursed, or whether you're secretly doing something to prevent pregnancy. Medieval people had no understanding of reproductive cycles, ovulation, or fertility windows. They didn't know that stress, poor nutrition, and the trauma you've already endured could affect your ability to conceive. They only knew that some women got pregnant quickly and others didn't, and they attributed this to moral character, divine favor, or supernatural interference. When you do finally become pregnant, probably within your first year of marriage, the real nightmare begins. Medieval pregnancy isn't managed by doctors or midwives who understand anatomy and physiology. It's overseen by women in your community who pass down folk wisdom that ranges from helpful to deadly, often with no way to distinguish between the two. Your diet during pregnancy is whatever your household can afford, which probably means a lot of bread, porridge, and very little protein or fresh vegetables. The medieval understanding of prenatal nutrition is non-existent. Pregnant women are often encouraged to eat for 2, but when food is scarce, you might actually receive smaller portions because you're not doing as much physical labor. Malnutrition during pregnancy increases your risk of complications, but no one makes the connection between diet and maternal health. You're expected to continue working throughout your pregnancy until you literally cannot stand. Rest is considered laziness, and pregnancy isn't seen as a medical condition that requires special care. You're still hauling water, tending animals, cooking over open fires, and doing heavy household labor that puts stress on your developing baby and your own body. Medieval pregnancy is filled with superstitions that can be harmful or even deadly. If you experience morning sickness, you might be given herbs that are actually toxic to developing babies. If you have cravings, you're told they represent the baby's needs, so you might consume things that are completely inappropriate or dangerous. If you have mood swings or emotional changes, you might be accused of being possessed again, leading to another round of exorcism attempts. The physical discomforts of pregnancy are managed with remedies that often make things worse. Back pain might be treated with bloodletting, which weakens you when you need strength most. Swelling might be addressed with diuretic herbs that dehydrate you. Headaches could lead to more spiritual intervention, because clearly the demons are back and trying to harm your unborn child. As your pregnancy progresses, the focus shifts to preparing for childbirth, which everyone knows is extremely dangerous. In medieval times, somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 women died in childbirth or from complications within the first few weeks after delivery. These aren't comforting odds, and everyone in your community knows someone who didn't survive their pregnancy. The preparations for childbirth are grim. Your household begins making arrangements for the possibility that you might die. Your husband might start considering remarriage options. Your mother-in-law discusses who will care for the baby if you don't survive. These conversations happen around you, not with you, as if you're already halfway gone. When labor begins, you're attended by local women who have experience with childbirth, but no formal medical training. There are no sterile instruments, no pain relief, no emergency interventions available if something goes wrong. The midwife's tools consist of whatever she carries in her bag: herbs of questionable effectiveness, holy relics that are supposed to ease labor, and her own hands, which haven't been washed properly because hand washing before medical procedures won't be invented for centuries. Labor might last for days, with you becoming increasingly exhausted, dehydrated, and weak. If the baby is positioned incorrectly, if the cord is wrapped around its neck, if you develop infections, or if any number of other complications arise, there's very little anyone can do to help you. The mortality rate for both mothers and babies is staggering by modern standards. If you survive childbirth, your recovery period is brief and often complicated by infection. The same unsanitary conditions that made your first period dangerous now threaten your life again. Puerperal sepsis, infection of the reproductive tract after childbirth, kills many women who survive the actual delivery. The fever, pain, and delirium of post-birth infection are often attributed to spiritual causes rather than medical ones. But even if you survive your first pregnancy and childbirth, your ordeal is far from over. Medieval families need many children because infant and child mortality rates are so high. You're expected to become pregnant again as soon as your body can physically manage it, often within a year of your previous birth. Each pregnancy rolls the dice with your life again, and the odds don't improve with experience. Most medieval women who survive to adulthood spend the majority of their fertile years either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. The monthly bleeding that terrified everyone when you were 12 becomes a rare occurrence, replaced by the even more dangerous cycle of pregnancy, birth, brief recovery, and pregnancy again. Your body becomes a battlefield where you're fighting for survival with each new child you're expected to produce. And for those few women who can't or won't follow this path, medieval society has another option: the convent, where different but equally deadly challenges await. Not every medieval girl who started menstruating was immediately married off to the first available man. Some families, whether due to lack of dowry, physical disabilities, or genuine religious calling, chose a different path for their daughters, the convent. This might sound like a merciful alternative to forced marriage and deadly childbirth, but unfortunately, medieval religious life for women came with its own unique set of life-threatening challenges. If you thought marriage was dangerous, wait until you see what passes for spiritual salvation in a 14th century nunnery. When families couldn't afford a dowry large enough to secure a decent marriage, or when a daughter was considered unmarriageable due to physical deformity or perceived spiritual contamination from her menstrual episodes, the convent became the dumping ground of last resort. This wasn't a choice you made for yourself. Girls as young as 8 or 9 were handed over to religious communities, often against their will, because their families simply couldn't support them or find them husbands. The process of becoming a nun began with a probationary period where you lived in the convent community while being evaluated for your suitability to religious life. This evaluation had nothing to do with your actual spiritual calling or your desire to serve God. Instead, it focused on your ability to be completely obedient, to suppress any signs of independent thinking, and to accept physical hardship without complaint. Your monthly bleeding, which had already marked you as spiritually suspect, was seen as evidence that you needed extra purification to be worthy of religious life. Medieval convents operated on the principle that physical suffering was spiritually beneficial, and that women, being inherently more sinful than men, needed more suffering to achieve salvation. Your daily routine involved practices designed to mortify the flesh and break down your individual will. You woke before dawn for the first of many prayer sessions that would consume most of your waking hours. The chapel was unheated, even in the depths of winter, because comfort was considered spiritually dangerous. Your diet in the convent was deliberately inadequate. Fasting wasn't just the occasional spiritual practice, it was a way of life. You might eat only bread and water for days at a time, or be limited to a single small meal per day. The theory was that keeping your body weak would make your spirit stronger, but in practice, chronic malnutrition made you susceptible to every disease that passed through the community and left you too weak to resist the more extreme forms of religious discipline. Speaking was heavily regulated and often forbidden entirely. You might spend weeks in complete silence, communicating only through gestures. This wasn't just about maintaining a peaceful atmosphere for prayer. It was about breaking down your sense of individual identity and training you to exist without expressing personal thoughts or desires. Your monthly periods, which continued despite your religious vows, had to be managed in complete silence, adding humiliation to the physical discomfort. The most dangerous aspect of convent life was the emphasis on self-inflicted suffering as a form of spiritual discipline. Self-flagellation, beating yourself with whips or chains, was not only permitted but encouraged as a way to purify your soul and demonstrate your devotion to Christ. These sessions often took place in groups, with nuns competing to see who could endure the most pain or draw the most blood. Infection from these self-inflicted wounds was common, and many women died from sepsis contracted during these spiritual exercises. Your menstrual periods in the convent were treated as especially shameful reminders of your fallen female nature. Unlike married women, who were expected to become pregnant and stop menstruating, nuns were supposed to transcend their physical bodies entirely. When you bled each month, it was seen as evidence that you hadn't achieved sufficient spiritual purity. You might be subjected to additional fasting, extra hours of prayer, or more severe physical punishments to help you overcome this monthly failure. The living conditions in medieval convents were often worse than those in ordinary households. Dormitories were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and infested with vermin. Disease spread rapidly through these confined communities, and the combination of malnutrition, poor hygiene, and suppressed immune systems from constant stress made epidemics particularly deadly. When plague struck a convent, entire communities could be wiped out within weeks, and medical care in convents was primitive even by medieval standards. Many communities relied entirely on prayer for healing, viewing illness as either divine punishment for sin or spiritual testing that should be endured without complaint. When nuns did receive medical treatment, it was often administered by other nuns who had no training beyond folk remedies and religious superstition. Bloodletting was common for any ailment, including menstrual problems, further weakening already malnourished bodies. The psychological pressure of convent life was crushing. You were constantly monitored for signs of spiritual weakness, rebellious thoughts, or attachment to worldly things. Any expression of personality, creativity, or independent thinking was punished severely. Depression was interpreted as lack of faith, anxiety was seen as insufficient trust in God, mental breakdown was viewed as demonic influence requiring exorcism. Many women who entered convents as children never developed normal social skills or emotional resilience, becoming permanently damaged by the isolation and repression. Some convents practiced extreme forms of asceticism that were essentially slow suicide. Women might be encouraged to sleep on beds of thorns, wear hair shirts that caused constant irritation and infection, or bind their bodies so tightly that circulation was impaired. These practices were seen as holy and admirable, but they often led to permanent physical damage or death. The irony of convent life was that it was supposed to offer spiritual salvation and protection from the dangers of secular life, but it often proved just as deadly as marriage and childbirth. Women died from malnutrition, infection, disease, and the physical trauma of extreme ascetic practices. The death rates in some medieval convents were comparable to those on battlefields. But even in the convent, your monthly bleeding continued to be a source of shame, medical intervention, and social isolation. Whether you were a wife dying in childbirth or a nun mortifying your flesh in pursuit of salvation, the biological process that had terrorized your family when you were 12 continued to be treated as a curse that needed to be managed, controlled, or endured. And each month brought new opportunities for infection, medical malpractice, and life-threatening complications. Whether you're a wife in a peasant cottage or a nun in a stone cell, one thing remains constant and terrifying. Every month, your body repeats the same nightmare that nearly killed you the first time. Except now, instead of being a shocking one-time event that mobilizes your entire community, your period has become a routine emergency that you're expected to manage quietly, efficiently, and without complaining. The monthly return of your bleeding brings with it a fresh cycle of infection risk, social isolation, and potential death that you'll face roughly 400 times over the course of your reproductive life, assuming you live that long. Let's talk about the practical reality of managing menstruation in medieval times, because the materials available to you are essentially whatever your household can spare, and those materials are going to try to kill you slowly, one period at a time. If you're lucky, you might have access to old linen rags that have been torn from worn-out clothing or bed sheets. These rags haven't been washed with soap because soap is expensive and harsh, and they haven't been boiled to kill bacteria because no one understands that bacteria exist. More likely, especially if you're from a poor family, you're using whatever absorbent material you can find. Moss gathered from the forest floor might seem like a natural, soft option, but it's teeming with parasites, bacteria, and fungal spores that are delighted to find a warm, moist environment to multiply in. Grass or straw might be used in desperate situations, but these materials are rough, non-absorbent, and full of dirt and animal waste that will introduce deadly infections directly into your most vulnerable body parts. Some women use wool, which seems like it would be better than plant materials, but medieval wool processing involves chemicals and techniques that leave the fibers harsh and potentially toxic. The wool hasn't been properly cleaned. It might still contain lanolin and other sheep-derived substances that can cause allergic reactions, and it definitely hasn't been sterilized in any meaningful way. The most horrifying aspect of medieval menstrual management is how long these materials stay in contact with your body. Modern understanding tells us that menstrual products should be changed frequently to prevent bacterial growth, but in medieval times, materials are precious and can't be wasted. You might use the same rag or moss for your entire period, which could last anywhere from 3 to 7 days. By the end of that time, you're essentially carrying a bacterial culture experiment between your legs. Washing these materials between uses isn't really an option either. Water has to be hauled from wells or streams, heated over fires, and soap is a luxury that most families can't afford regularly. Even when materials are washed, they're often just rinsed in cold water and hung to dry in damp conditions that encourage bacterial and fungal growth rather than eliminating it. You might be reusing the same contaminated rags month after month, building up layers of infection-causing microorganisms with each cycle. The lack of understanding about hygiene during menstruation means that you're also not washing your body properly during your period. Medieval people believed that too much washing could actually be harmful, opening your pores to disease and evil influences. So you're bleeding into dirty materials while not cleaning yourself adequately, creating perfect conditions for what we now know as toxic shock syndrome, sepsis, and various other life-threatening infections. Your monthly bleeding also brings with it a cascade of social restrictions that add psychological trauma to the physical dangers. You're considered spiritually unclean during your period, which means you can't participate in religious services, touch holy objects, or enter certain parts of churches. You can't prepare food for your family because your touch might contaminate it. You can't help with brewing or dairy work because your presence might sour the products. These restrictions often mean that you're isolated in a separate part of your home or even banished to a special hut during your period. This isolation might sound restful, but it's actually dangerous. You're separated from warmth, adequate food, and medical help if complications arise. If you develop a fever from infection, if you experience unusually heavy bleeding, or if you have other medical emergencies, help might not reach you in time. The monthly cycle of bleeding, infection risk, and social isolation takes a cumulative toll on your physical and mental health. Each period weakens you a little more, introduces new infections, and reinforces the message that your body is disgusting, dangerous, and fundamentally wrong. Women who survive multiple years of this cycle often develop chronic health problems that medieval medicine can't understand or treat effectively. Anemia from repeated blood loss combined with poor nutrition is almost universal among menstruating medieval women. You're constantly tired, weak, and pale, but these symptoms are seen as natural female frailty rather than treatable medical conditions. Iron deficiency makes you more susceptible to infection and less able to recover from the monthly trauma your body endures. Reproductive tract infections become chronic and progressively worse with each menstrual cycle. What starts as minor irritation from dirty rags develops into serious bacterial infections that can spread to your kidneys, abdomen, and bloodstream. Medieval medicine has no concept of antibiotics, antiseptics, or even basic hygiene, so these infections often become systemic and fatal. The psychological impact of monthly fear, pain, and humiliation creates what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. You live in constant dread of your next period, knowing that it will bring pain, infection risk, and social rejection. This chronic stress weakens your immune system and makes you more vulnerable to all the other diseases and dangers of medieval life. Some women develop what appear to be eating disorders, refusing food during their periods, either because they believe it will reduce their bleeding or because the nausea from infections makes eating impossible. Others become obsessive about cleanliness rituals that don't actually help but give them a sense of control over an uncontrollable situation. But here and there, scattered throughout medieval Europe, there were women who possessed dangerous knowledge about herbs, hygiene, and healing that could actually help with menstrual problems. These women walked a thin line between being helpful healers and being burned as witches, because any woman who knew too much about female bodies was automatically suspect. Hidden in the shadows of medieval society, passed down through whispered conversations between mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters, there existed a network of knowledge that could actually help women survive their monthly bleeding. But this knowledge was so dangerous to possess that sharing it could get you tortured, drowned, or burned alive. These were the wise women, the village healers, the midwives who understood more about female bodies than any officially trained physician, and who risked everything to help other women survive what society had deemed a natural curse. These women learned their craft through generations of careful observation, trial and error, and desperate necessity. While male physicians studied ancient texts that were wildly inaccurate about female anatomy, wise women learned by actually attending births, treating menstrual problems, and watching what worked and what killed their patients. They developed a practical understanding of herbs, hygiene, and healing that was far more effective than anything available through official medical channels. The wise women knew which plants could ease menstrual cramps without causing the hallucinations and convulsions that came with ergot poisoning. Willow bark, which contains the same active ingredient as modern aspirin, could reduce pain and inflammation when prepared correctly. Raspberry leaf tea could strengthen the uterus and reduce heavy bleeding. Yarrow could help with clotting and wound healing. These remedies weren't perfect and they weren't always available, but they were vastly safer than mercury, lead, and the other toxic substances prescribed by trained physicians. More importantly, wise women understood the connection between cleanliness and infection in ways that wouldn't be officially recognized by medicine for centuries. They knew that washing hands before examining patients reduced complications. They understood that clean cloths were safer than dirty ones for managing menstrual bleeding. They recognized that certain symptoms indicated serious infections that needed immediate treatment rather than spiritual intervention. But possessing this knowledge was incredibly dangerous. The medieval church was deeply suspicious of women who seemed to have supernatural understanding of healing, especially when that healing involved female bodies and reproductive health. Any woman who could successfully treat menstrual problems, ease childbirth, or help with fertility issues was automatically suspect of practicing witchcraft or making deals with demons. The line between helpful healer and accused witch was razor-thin and constantly shifting. A wise woman might be celebrated in her community for years, helping women through difficult births and treating their monthly ailments effectively. But if she treated someone who died anyway, if she had a personality conflict with local authorities, or if someone wanted to settle a personal grudge, accusations of witchcraft could follow quickly. The very knowledge that made these women valuable also made them vulnerable. They knew about herbs that could end unwanted pregnancies, which was useful in a world where rape, incest, and forced marriage were common, but which also made them accessories to what the church considered murder. They understood how to delay or regulate menstrual cycles, which could help women manage their bleeding more effectively, but which could also be interpreted as interfering with God's natural order. Wise women often worked in secret, meeting with patients in hidden locations and sharing their knowledge only with trusted allies. They developed coded language for discussing treatments, disguising medical advice as cooking tips or household hints. A recipe for a particular soup might actually be instructions for preparing an herbal remedy for menstrual pain. Advice about cleaning techniques might contain information about preventing infections. The most successful wise women learned to work within existing power structures rather than challenging them directly. They might collaborate with local priests, framing their treatments as prayers or blessed remedies rather than medical interventions. They might partner with male physicians, allowing the doctors to take credit for successful treatments while quietly providing the actual effective care behind the scenes. But even these careful strategies couldn't always protect them. The witch trials that periodically swept through medieval Europe specifically targeted women with medical knowledge. The Malleus Maleficarum, a manual for identifying and prosecuting witches, explicitly warned that midwives and healers were particularly likely to be in league with Satan. The logic was circular and deadly. If a woman could heal, she must have supernatural knowledge, and supernatural knowledge could only come from evil sources. The trials and executions of wise women had a devastating impact on women's health throughout medieval Europe. Each burned healer represented decades of accumulated knowledge about treating female health problems effectively. When these women died, their knowledge often died with them because the dangerous political climate made it too risky for others to openly continue their work. Some wise women tried to preserve their knowledge by writing it down, but literacy was rare among women, and written medical texts by female authors were often destroyed as evidence of witchcraft. Others attempted to train successors, but the student-teacher relationships had to be so secretive that knowledge was often lost or corrupted in transmission. The persecution of wise women also created a climate of fear that prevented women from seeking help for menstrual problems until they were already dying. If going to a healer meant risking association with witchcraft, many women chose to suffer in silence rather than seek treatment. This meant that treatable infections became fatal, manageable conditions deteriorated into medical emergencies, and countless women died from problems that the wise women could have addressed effectively. The irony was that while the church and medical establishment were busy persecuting the women who actually understood female health, they continued to promote treatments that were actively harmful. Official medicine kept prescribing bloodletting for anemia, mercury for infections, and surgical procedures that had mortality rates approaching 100%. Meanwhile, the women who knew about willow bark for pain relief and clean cloth for infection prevention were being burned as witches. Even in communities where wise women managed to avoid persecution, their ability to help was limited by the same social and economic constraints that affected all medieval women. They couldn't change the fact that girls were married off at 12 and expected to bear children immediately. They couldn't prevent the poverty and malnutrition that made women more vulnerable to complications. They couldn't overcome the religious restrictions that prevented women from accessing education about their own bodies. But despite all these limitations and dangers, some women did manage to survive their reproductive years with the help of wise women's knowledge. These lucky few discovered that menstruation didn't have to be a monthly death sentence, that pain could be managed, that infections could be prevented, and that female bodies weren't fundamentally cursed or evil. Out of the thousands of girls who started menstruating in medieval Europe, a tiny percentage managed to survive not just their first period, but their entire reproductive lives without dying from the monthly nightmare that claimed so many of their sisters. These women were the exceptions that proved the rule, the lucky few whose circumstances, knowledge, or sheer chance allowed them to navigate the deadly landscape of medieval female health. Their stories reveal what was possible when the stars aligned, when families made different choices, or when access to hidden knowledge made the difference between life and death. The most fortunate girls were born into noble families, wealthy enough to afford slightly better medical care, and educated enough to seek out information about women's health from sources beyond local superstition. These families might have access to imported medicines, silk cloths for menstrual management instead of rough wool or moss, and physicians who had studied in universities where some actual medical knowledge, however limited, was preserved alongside the nonsense. Lady Margaret de Clare, a fictional but representative example of these privileged survivors, might have experienced her first period in a castle where her mother had already prepared her with basic information about what to expect. Her family could afford to keep her well-fed during her adolescence, which meant her body was stronger and more resilient when faced with the challenges of menstruation. Her periods might have been managed with fine linen cloths that were washed regularly by servants, reducing her risk of infection. More importantly, wealthy families often had connections to communities of educated women, sometimes nuns who had preserved fragments of classical medical knowledge, or occasionally female scholars who had managed to gain access to medical texts. These women might know that menstrual blood wasn't actually poisonous, that bleeding was a natural process rather than a spiritual curse, and that certain herbs could help with pain and heavy bleeding without causing dangerous side effects. Some lucky girls found themselves in households where wise women had gained the trust and protection of powerful patrons. A village healer who had successfully treated a noble's wife or daughter might be allowed to continue her practice under official protection, sharing her knowledge with other women in the community without fear of persecution. These protected healers could teach proper hygiene, effective herbal remedies, and practical management techniques that dramatically improved survival rates. Religious communities occasionally produced women who managed to combine spiritual authority with medical knowledge in ways that protected them from accusations of witchcraft. Hildegard of Bingen, the famous medieval mystic, wrote extensively about women's health and herbal medicine while maintaining her position as a respected religious figure. Women in her circle had access to information about managing menstruation that was both effective and officially sanctioned by church authorities. Geographic location played a crucial role in survival as well. Women living in areas with strong traditions of female healing, such as certain regions of Ireland or rural France, might have access to generations of accumulated knowledge about managing periods safely. These communities sometimes developed sophisticated understanding of which plants were helpful, how to prepare them correctly, and how to recognize and treat the early signs of infection. Some women survived through fortunate timing that allowed them to avoid the worst medical interventions of their era. A girl whose first period occurred during a time when the local priest was distracted by other concerns might escape the traumatic exorcism attempts that claimed other victims. A woman whose periods were light and relatively painless might avoid the attention of physicians altogether, allowing her body to function naturally without dangerous medical interference. Trade connections occasionally provided access to better materials and medicines. Families involved in textile production might have access to finer, cleaner cloths for menstrual management. Merchants with connections to Mediterranean trade routes might obtain herbs and medicines that weren't available locally. These small advantages could make the difference between chronic infection and relative health. The lucky few also learned strategies for working within existing social restrictions rather than challenging them directly. They became experts at managing their periods so discreetly that the monthly isolation and social stigma were minimized. They learned to recognize the early signs of infection and seek help before complications became life-threatening. They developed networks of female support that provided practical advice and emotional assistance during difficult times. Some women survived by making strategic choices about marriage and reproduction that reduced their exposure to the deadliest aspects of medieval female life. A woman who married a kind husband who didn't insist on immediate and constant pregnancy might have time to recover between childbirths. A woman whose family was prosperous enough to afford adequate nutrition during pregnancy had better chances of surviving childbirth and recovering successfully. Certain occupations provided women with knowledge and resources that improved their survival odds. Midwives, despite the risks associated with their profession, often developed expertise in managing their own health as well as helping other women. Female merchants might have access to better materials and information through their business connections. Women in religious communities sometimes had access to preserved medical texts and educated mentors. The survivors also demonstrated remarkable adaptability and resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. They learned to read their own body's signals, to distinguish between normal discomfort and dangerous symptoms, and to seek help when they needed it. They developed pain management techniques that didn't rely on toxic medicines, using meditation, physical positioning, and herbal remedies that were both safe and effective. But, perhaps most importantly, the lucky few often became sources of hope and knowledge for other women in their communities. A woman who had successfully managed her periods for years might quietly share her techniques with younger women, creating small networks of practical wisdom that operated below the radar of official disapproval. These informal mentorship relationships saved lives by passing on survival strategies from one generation to the next. Even among the lucky few, survival often came at a cost. Many of these women lived with chronic health problems, reproductive issues, or psychological trauma from their experiences. They might have survived their periods, but the stress and fear of monthly uncertainty took its toll on their overall well-being and life expectancy. However, their existence proved that survival was possible, that medieval women's health problems weren't entirely inevitable, and that knowledge, resources, and social support could make a dramatic difference in outcomes. These women represented what might have been possible if medieval society had understood and valued female health, if medical knowledge had been more accurate, and if women had been allowed to share information about their own bodies without fear of persecution. Beyond the physical dangers of infection, medical malpractice, and social isolation, the psychological trauma of experiencing puberty in medieval times was devastating in ways that are difficult for modern minds to comprehend. Imagine trying to develop a healthy sense of self when your body's natural functions are treated as evidence of spiritual corruption, when your transition into adulthood is marked by terror rather than celebration, and when every month brings fresh reminders that you are fundamentally broken, dangerous, and unwanted. The psychological damage began long before your first period, rooted in medieval society's fundamental beliefs about female nature. From earliest childhood, you absorbed messages that women were inherently more sinful than men, more susceptible to temptation, and more likely to be influenced by evil forces. Your body was described as a vessel of corruption, your emotions as evidence of spiritual weakness, and your very existence as a constant reminder of humanity's fall from grace. When your first period arrived, it confirmed every negative message you had ever heard about being female. The terror, pain, and confusion of that initial bleeding were interpreted as proof that these teachings about women's corrupt nature were true. You weren't experiencing a normal biological process, you were witnessing your own spiritual downfall, the moment when whatever innocence you might have possessed was literally bleeding away. The adults around you reinforced this interpretation through their reactions. Instead of receiving comfort, education, or reassurance, you were met with fear, disgust, and urgent attempts to fix or control what was happening to your body. The message was clear: you had become something dangerous that needed to be managed, contained, or eliminated through marriage as quickly as possible. This fundamental rejection of your changing body created deep psychological splits between your sense of self and your physical existence. You learned to view your own body as an enemy, something that betrayed you monthly and caused problems for everyone around you. The natural curiosity and self-exploration that characterize healthy adolescent development were replaced with shame, fear, and active avoidance of understanding your own physical nature. The monthly cycle of bleeding, isolation, and social rejection created a form of psychological torture that repeated itself endlessly throughout your reproductive years. Every 28 days or so, you faced the same sequence of physical discomfort, social ostracism, and spiritual humiliation. You lived in constant anticipation of the next episode, unable to plan or hope for extended periods of normalcy because you knew the nightmare would return regularly. Medieval society provided no language or framework for understanding these experiences as normal or manageable. There were no coming-of-age rituals that celebrated your transition into womanhood, no educational resources that explained what was happening to your body, and no social support systems that helped you develop coping strategies. Instead, you were expected to suffer in silence while pretending that nothing significant was happening to you. The lack of accurate information about reproduction and sexuality created additional psychological burdens. You had no understanding of why your body was changing, what the bleeding meant, or how reproduction actually worked. This ignorance made every new symptom terrifying and unpredictable. Breast development, mood changes, sexual feelings, and other normal aspects of puberty were all mysterious and potentially dangerous phenomena that no one could explain to you accurately. The speed with which you were expected to transition from childhood to adult responsibilities was psychologically devastating. One day, you were a child playing with other children, and the next day, you were a woman expected to manage a household, bear children, and navigate complex adult social relationships. There was no gradual transition, no time to adjust to your changing body and emotions, no opportunity to develop mature coping skills before facing adult challenges. Marriage, which was supposed to solve the problem of your dangerous femininity, often created new psychological traumas. You were expected to be sexually available to a man you barely knew, to become pregnant immediately, and to manage a household while still recovering from the trauma of your first menstrual experiences. The emotional support and understanding you needed to process these changes were completely absent from most medieval marriages. The constant threat of death from childbirth, infection, or medical treatment created a state of chronic anxiety that affected every aspect of your mental health. You lived with the knowledge that each period might be complicated by life-threatening infections, that pregnancy was likely to kill you, and that the medical treatments available were often more dangerous than the problems they claimed to solve. This constant fear made it impossible to develop healthy relationships with your own body or to plan for any kind of future. Religious teachings that emphasized women's spiritual inferiority created additional psychological damage by making you feel responsible for your own suffering. If your periods were painful, if you struggled with mood changes, or if you experienced sexual feelings, these were interpreted as evidence of your moral failings rather than normal human experiences. You were taught to blame yourself for natural biological processes while being given no tools to understand or manage them effectively. The isolation during menstruation prevented you from developing normal social relationships and support networks. Each month, you were cut off from community life just when you needed connection and understanding most. This repeated social rejection made it difficult to develop confidence, assertiveness, or the interpersonal skills needed to navigate adult relationships successfully. Many medieval women developed what we would now recognize as severe mental health disorders as a result of these experiences. Depression was common, but interpreted as spiritual weakness rather than a treatable condition. Anxiety disorders were seen as lack of faith. Eating disorders developed as women tried to control their body's functions through food restriction. Self-harm behaviors were sometimes encouraged as spiritual discipline rather than recognized as signs of psychological distress. The cumulative effect of these psychological traumas was often the complete suppression of female agency, creativity, and self-expression. Women learned to make themselves small, quiet, and invisible to avoid drawing attention to their dangerous femininity. They internalized messages about their own worthlessness so deeply that they became unable to advocate for themselves or seek better treatment even when it was available. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this psychological damage was how it prepared women to inflict the same trauma on their own daughters. Mothers who had never been allowed to understand or celebrate their own bodies couldn't provide their daughters with better information or more supportive experiences. The cycle of fear, shame, and ignorance continued from generation to generation, creating a self-perpetuating system of psychological abuse that lasted for centuries. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medieval menstruation wasn't just the individual suffering it caused, but how it created an unbreakable cycle of trauma that passed from mother to daughter across generations. Women who had survived the nightmare of medieval puberty found themselves completely powerless to protect their own children from experiencing the same horrors. They were trapped in a system that forced them to perpetuate the very abuse and ignorance that had nearly destroyed them, creating a generational curse that seemed impossible to break. Imagine surviving your own traumatic introduction to menstruation, enduring years of monthly infections, painful treatments, and social isolation, only to watch helplessly as your 12-year-old daughter begins to experience the same terror you remember so vividly. You know exactly what's coming, you understand the dangers she faces, but you're forbidden by social convention, religious doctrine, and legal restrictions from doing anything meaningful to help her. Medieval mothers couldn't prepare their daughters for menstruation because discussing such matters was considered inappropriate and potentially corrupting. The same religious authorities who had terrorized you as a child now insisted that knowledge about bodily functions would encourage sinful thoughts in young girls. Even basic information about what to expect was forbidden, leaving each new generation to face the shock and terror of unexplained bleeding with no preparation whatsoever. The most excruciating part was having to participate in your daughter's trauma while pretending it was necessary and normal. When your child woke up bleeding and terrified, you had to react with the same fear and urgency that had traumatized you, calling for priests and physicians whose treatments you knew from experience were more likely to harm than help. You couldn't comfort her with accurate information or reassure her that the bleeding was natural, because doing so would mark you both as spiritually suspect. You watched your daughter endure the same brutal medical treatments that had nearly killed you, knowing they were useless and dangerous, but unable to refuse them without bringing accusations of witchcraft or heresy down on your family. You held her hand while barber surgeons bled her weak body, forced toxic herbs down her throat, and subjected her to invasive examinations, all while maintaining the pretense that these treatments were necessary for her spiritual and physical health. The marriage negotiations that began immediately after your daughter's first period were particularly agonizing because you understood exactly what kind of life awaited her. You knew the terror of wedding night rape disguised as conjugal duty, the pain and danger of medieval childbirth, and the endless cycle of pregnancy and recovery that would consume her adolescence and early adulthood. But you also knew that marriage was the only socially acceptable option for a menstruating girl, and that failing to arrange it quickly would bring shame and poverty to your entire family. Some mothers tried to find subtle ways to help their daughters within the constraints of what was socially acceptable. They might quietly share basic hygiene tips disguised as general cleanliness advice, or provide cleaner rags for menstrual management while pretending they were just old household linens. They might teach their daughters which herbs were helpful for pain relief by including them in cooking lessons, or share information about recognizing infection symptoms by discussing general health maintenance. But these small acts of rebellion were dangerous and limited in their effectiveness. Mothers who shared too much practical knowledge about menstruation risked being accused of practicing folk medicine or witchcraft. Those who challenged religious teachings about female spiritual inferiority could be reported to authorities by their own neighbors or family members. Even the most careful attempts to protect daughters had to be balanced against the very real threat of persecution. The economic pressures surrounding daughters' menstruation created additional stress for mothers who were already struggling to survive. Each month that a daughter remained unmarried represented a drain on family resources and a growing risk of scandal. Mothers found themselves hoping for early marriages for their children, even when they knew those marriages would be dangerous and traumatic, because the alternatives were even worse. Wealthy mothers had slightly more options but faced their own unique challenges. They might be able to provide better medical care and living conditions, but they were also under more intense social scrutiny and pressure to maintain family reputation. A noble daughter's menstrual problems could become political liabilities that affected marriage alliances and inheritance negotiations. The most devastating aspect of this generational trauma was how it prevented the accumulation of knowledge that could have improved women's health over time. Each generation of mothers had learned painful lessons about managing menstruation, recognizing dangerous symptoms, and navigating social restrictions, but they were largely unable to pass this knowledge on to their daughters in any systematic way. Wisdom died with each woman instead of building into a body of practical knowledge that could benefit future generations. Some mothers developed strategies for preserving and transmitting knowledge despite official restrictions. They might teach daughters through stories, songs, or coded household activities that contained hidden information about women's health. They created informal networks with other mothers, sharing information about helpful healers, effective remedies, and survival strategies through carefully disguised conversations. The psychological burden of watching their daughters suffer was enormous for medieval mothers. Many developed what we would now recognize as complex trauma responses, becoming hypervigilant about their daughters' health while simultaneously feeling helpless to protect them. The constant stress of trying to keep daughters safe within an inherently dangerous system took its toll on their own mental and physical health. Religious mothers faced the additional torment of believing that their daughters' suffering was spiritually necessary while simultaneously wanting to protect them from harm. They were caught between maternal instinct and religious doctrine, forced to choose between their children's immediate welfare and their eternal salvation according to church teachings. Even mothers who managed to help their daughters survive to adulthood carried the knowledge that they would eventually become grandmothers, forced to watch the same cycle repeat itself with the next generation. The trauma wasn't just personal, it was hereditary, passed down through families like a genetic disorder that no one understood how to cure. This generational perpetuation of trauma created a society where women's suffering was normalized, where dangerous ignorance was preserved and protected, and where each new generation faced the same preventable horrors that had claimed their mothers and grandmothers. Breaking this cycle would require fundamental changes in religious doctrine, medical knowledge, and social structures that seemed impossible from within the system. As we reach the end of our journey through the nightmare of medieval menstruation, it's important to understand that the horrors we've described didn't end overnight. The transition from the deadly ignorance of the Middle Ages to anything resembling modern understanding of women's health was a slow, painful process that took centuries and cost countless lives. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, cracks began to appear in the wall of superstition and medical malpractice that had made menstruation a monthly death sentence for so many women. The Renaissance brought the first glimmers of hope, though change came so slowly that individual women saw little benefit in their lifetimes. As trade routes expanded and universities grew, scholars gained access to medical texts from the Islamic world, where physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina had developed more sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology. These texts contained revolutionary ideas that women's bodies followed natural laws rather than supernatural ones, that menstruation served a biological purpose, and that many female disorders could be treated with observation and logic rather than exorcism and bloodletting. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century accelerated the spread of medical knowledge, making it possible for information to survive and spread beyond the limited circles of university-trained physicians. For the first time, practical medical advice could be preserved in books, rather than relying entirely on oral tradition that died with each persecuted wise woman. Though literacy remained limited, especially among women, the existence of written medical knowledge meant that helpful information had a better chance of surviving and reaching those who needed it. Gradually, very gradually, some physicians began to question the traditional treatments that had been killing their patients for centuries. The practice of bloodletting for menstrual problems slowly declined as doctors noticed that patients who avoided this treatment often recovered better than those who received it. Herbal remedies became more sophisticated as physicians learned to distinguish between helpful and harmful plants, though this process took generations and many women died from continued experimentation. The Protestant Reformation, despite its own problems, inadvertently helped women's health by reducing the Catholic Church's absolute authority over medical practice. In regions where religious control loosened, healers faced less persecution for possessing knowledge about women's bodies. This didn't eliminate the dangers faced by wise women, but it created small spaces where practical medical knowledge could develop without immediate accusations of heresy. The slow growth of scientific thinking during the 16th and 17th centuries brought new approaches to understanding the human body. Physicians began conducting systematic observations of their patients rather than relying entirely on ancient texts and religious doctrine. Anatomical studies, though still primitive and often inaccurate, started to replace pure speculation about how women's bodies functioned. Perhaps most importantly, women themselves began to document their experiences in ways that preserved knowledge for future generations. Literate women started keeping detailed records of their health, their treatments, and what worked or failed to work. These personal accounts created a body of practical knowledge that complemented and often contradicted official medical teaching. The establishment of lying-in hospitals in major cities during the 17th and 18th centuries, while still dangerous by modern standards, represented the first systematic attempts to study and improve women's health outcomes. Midwives and physicians working in these institutions began to notice patterns in what caused infections, which treatments were helpful, and how to reduce mortality rates during childbirth. The development of microscopy in the 17th century revolutionized understanding of infection and disease, though it took another 2 centuries for germ theory to be fully accepted and applied to medical practice. For the first time, physicians could see the bacteria and other microorganisms that caused the infections that had been killing menstruating women for centuries. Educational opportunities for women slowly expanded, creating the first generation of formally educated female healers since the persecution of wise women began. Though still limited and often opposed by established medical authorities, women who gained access to medical training brought crucial perspectives to understanding female health that had been missing from male-dominated medicine. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, observation, and individual rights gradually shifted cultural attitudes toward women's bodies and health. Though change was glacially slow and faced enormous resistance, the idea that women deserved accurate medical information and effective treatment began to gain ground among progressive thinkers. By the 19th century, the first recognizably modern approaches to women's health emerged. The development of anesthesia made surgical procedures survivable. The acceptance of hand-washing and sterilization dramatically reduced infection rates, and the systematic study of reproductive physiology began to reveal how menstruation actually worked. The invention of modern sanitary products, starting with the first commercial menstrual pads in the late 1800s, finally gave women safe, effective ways to manage their periods without risking deadly infections. For the first time in human history, menstruation could be managed hygienically and discreetly. The discovery of hormones in the early 20th century provided the scientific foundation for understanding why menstruation occurred and how it could be regulated safely. The development of birth control allowed women to control their reproductive cycles for the first time, reducing the deadly pattern of constant pregnancy that had claimed so many medieval women. Modern medicine finally understood that menstruation was not a curse, a disease, or evidence of spiritual corruption, but a normal biological process that could be managed safely with proper knowledge and materials. The monthly nightmare that had terrorized women for millennia became a manageable inconvenience that rarely threatened life or health. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your warm, safe bed, take a moment to appreciate the extraordinary progress that separates your experience from that of medieval women. You have access to pain relievers that actually work, sanitary products that prevent infection, medical care that understands your body, and a society that doesn't view your natural functions as evidence of spiritual corruption. The heating pad that soothes your cramps, the ibuprofen that reduces inflammation, the tampons or pads that keep you comfortable and clean, the doctors who can treat infections with antibiotics, the education that helps you understand your body. All of these represent victories won through centuries of women's suffering and the gradual triumph of knowledge over ignorance. You are the inheritor of this hard-won progress, the beneficiary of countless women who endured unimaginable horrors so that future generations might have better lives. Their suffering was not meaningless if it ultimately led to the safety and understanding you enjoy today. Sweet dreams, and remember, you survived. We all survived. And tomorrow, when you wake up in your comfortable bed, with your modern amenities and your scientific understanding of your own body, you'll be living proof that knowledge, compassion, and human progress can overcome even the darkest chapters of our shared history. Sleep well, knowing that the nightmare is over.